like if Tony Khan came up to us and said, hey, do it this way or do it that way, we'd probably just stop doing the podcast, because we don't want to be beholden to somebody. But at the same time, we haven't disrespected Tony Khan at all. So I
No.
don't think they have any concern. Ready.
What's going on, guys? It's your boy, Tom Talk Trash, and today I'm back for another interview. This time, I'm joined by Matt Koon from FTR with Dax. So welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, man. It's a pleasure to be here.
So if we take this back to the beginning, where do you discover wrestling as a fan?
Well, I'd say outside of a couple of times I watched it when I was younger, I watched it once when I was like 6 and once when I was 10. I became a real fan like at the age of 11 or 12. The build up to WrestleMania 1 and the Crockett territories, the build of the Horsemen, I'd say that's kind of the foundation of my fanship.
Mm. You talked about the build to WrestleMania 1 and things like that. What was it that, and obviously Crockett Promotions, and then being sort of two different styles of wrestling, why do you feel like they both appealed to you?
I don't know. Like I just liked wrestling, and you watch wrestling, you're attracted to it. You saw WrestleMania 1 being built up and all this cool stuff. And then you see this weird little studio show, with like 30 people in the audience and
Mm.
just a set and just promos and promos and promos and squash matches and squash matches. And it was just very intriguing to go like, oh, who's this guy? Is this guy good? Who's this tag team? Who's that? This guy's kind of like that other guy. And it's a very, very cool thing to kind of discover new wrestling.
Mm. So when you discover this wrestling, how does it change your life in terms of watching it? How much are you consuming? I'll put it that way.
Oh, well, man, I kind of got addicted right away and watched as much as I could. So, especially in my middle school years, I'd say through early high school, I watched, man, a lot. Maybe like I would watch every WWE show. So at the time, that was like Superstars and Challenge. I think
Mm.
one was on Saturday, one was on Sunday in the morning, or maybe they're both on. I can't remember. And then there was Tuesday Night Titans, which was on USA Network. There was Primetime Wrestling, which was on USA Network, and that was just WWE. And then you had Crockett, which had you had Georgia in the morning on TBS, and you had Crockett in the afternoon on Saturdays, and you had the main event on Sundays, and the World Class Wrestling was on I think around noon in California on around noon on Saturdays, and even like Polynesian Pacific Pro Wrestling was on the Financial News Network.
Mm.
So I watched as much as I could. I think for a while, during the Black Saturday era, Mid South made a few appearances on TBS. So as much as I could, after I was in, started buying the wrestling magazines, started following as much as I could, and then just being consuming as much as I could as a new fan.
Mm. And then if we move towards sort of the Attitude Era and places like that, how does that change your fandom when the two companies are more competing and Nitro launches?
That was probably the best time to be a wrestling fan. I kind of wish I was a little kid when that was happening. I wish I was a middle schooler when that was going on, because that was the best time. Because like you would tape Nitro and watch Raw, or tape Raw and watch Nitro, but then you couldn't help but flip back and forth. So you like, if you're watching Nitro, it hit a commercial, you'd go to Raw. If Raw was good, you'd stay on Raw for a while. You might miss something on Nitro. And it was just this really cool time because you had two companies that was professional wrestling. So very similar, but very different, both with exciting things going on. You had the growth of Stone Cold Steve Austin, maybe the most exciting part of wrestling in my lifetime. And then the NWO and Sting. And that was also going on. These were going on the same 1 year. It was a great wrestling.
Hmm. So you talked about the being a wrestling fan at that time and stuff. How does the war ending? I'll phrase it that way. How does the Monday Night Wars ending change your fandom?
Well, I mean, it changed it a little bit. You have to keep in mind that this is me as an adult now. This is me
Yeah, yeah.
married. This is me married. My son was born in 2002, so I guess the invasion is 2001 and or 2002 around that area. And so I was falling out of it a little bit just because of life and responsibilities. I had a job and a career, and I had a band, and I had a kid and a wife, and so after that that Attitude Era slash Monday Night Wars, I did stay in touch with it. I never left touch with it, but I wouldn't say I was watching like both WWE shows every single week. But I
Mm.
tried to stay on top of what was going on.
And then, as I understand it from my research, your son getting into wrestling really ignited your fandom again, correct?
Yeah, yeah, I stayed in it, and once my son turned about 8, 7, 8, 9 years old, we didn't let him watch it because it's violent. So,
Mm.
but he was intrigued by it because he couldn't watch it. He saw DVDs with these cool looking pictures of people on the cover, so he's very intrigued by it. And Matthew was a wrestling fan from the jump, from day one. His whole life, like he's worn wrestling shirts to school, and you know, um, introduced me to wrestlers like Orange Cassidy and companies like GCW. And what I decided was that, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, my wife and I divorced, and I had split custody of my son. And I'm thinking, man, I can do some cool stuff. I'm like, let's go to WrestleManias. I mean, I'm not rich, but we'll figure it out. We started going to WrestleManias. We went to WrestleMania 30, 31, 32, 33, 34. By the time 34 came around, I was involved in wrestling. So, like 30, at 30, we're in New Orleans and we're fans. We don't know what the hell's going on. We don't know how to get to access. We don't know if we should go to the Hall of Fame. We don't know anything. By WrestleMania 34, I'm on the floor of the Hall of Fame. I'm backstage at the Hall of Fame. And it is insane that, and Matthew is too, and we're sitting on the floor, with all the wrestlers and stuff at that time. So it's crazy how much changed in just like this 5 year period.
Mm. So you talked about the change in the 5 year period. How much has that changed your overall fandom, going from going to shows as a fan to maybe going to shows as a media? How has that changed your fandom?
It's interesting. I luckily haven't stopped being a fan. Like, I'm not really a media guy. I'm not a journalist. I'm a guy who plays music. I'm a guy who, got started on the Conrad podcast by doing music on his shows and producing the shows.
Mm.
Eventually got lucky enough to host some shows, but I'm not a media person like Sean Ross Sapp or whoever you want to say. I'm still a fan. So I can still go as a fan, but you have to act a little differently. You can't really act like a fan when you're hanging out with wrestlers. You can't really be like, ooh, you're my favorite, or whatever. But when I watch the stuff, though, I try to get lost in as much as I can and still enjoy what I enjoy. I think that's the strength. One of the strengths I bring as a host is I'm just a fan. As you've heard Conrad say a million times, I'm literally just a fan. I'm creating a show that I think I would enjoy. And if I enjoy it, I think wrestling fans will enjoy it because that's all I am as a wrestling fan. So even though I've got to do some crazy cool things, like looking back as a little kid, thinking of the things I've got to do now, my God, my little kid, Matt, would love that. But man, I don't walk in like I'm anybody at all. Like I'm just, even though I'm a big guy, so I'm really easy to spot. People know me, but I'm still just a fan. I try to
Mm.
keep that, and I do.
Mm, definitely. So what you talked about there, you've brought Codbrand up a few times, and obviously something to wrestle with. So how do you join his team overall?
Oh, I DM'd him. I DM'd Conrad, and I said, hey, I liked Conrad as a host of the Ric Flair show. He's just this affable, smart research guy who was really made it easy to listen to. And I was smart enough to hear it and go, wow, that host is doing a good job. Started following him on Twitter. Then something to wrestle with started. I didn't care about Bruce Pritchard. Matter of fact, very few people did because he didn't have a very high profile. And he also had another podcast before this.
Mm.
But Something to Wrestle With was great. I mean, it was this great show. So I wrote him, I wrote Conrad on Twitter, DM'd him, said, "Hey man, do you need someone to do some research?" He's like, "Yeah." So
Mm.
that led to me, doing research on some of the early Something to Wrestle With. Um, and then I started sending him some silly songs about wrestling. And the next thing you know, I get a call from Bruce and Conrad. "Can you do a theme song?" I'm like, "Yeah." And I said, "Yeah, I've never done them before," but I was like, "Yeah, I can do one." And I worked really hard. I spent a lot of hours on it because I knew it was a big opportunity. And then I produced the shows. And then when Tony started What Happened When, I produced that show, did the theme song for that show. And then things kind of took off from there.
Mm. So when you are starting to do research and stuff, is there a show that you did research for that you're like, that's a cool fact? I never knew that, for example.
You know, I can't really think of any moments like that, but I will say that looking back on certain shows, like the NWO and WWE or WWECW or Judgment Day, some of the earlier ones that I did, I look back and I'm pretty happy with it. I remember doing the research for Scott Hall. Matter of fact, I didn't do the research for Scott Hall, but like I remember he was recording it and they needed some more stuff. So I just wrote him a bunch of questions. And so
Mm.
to hear those questions being asked, to hear questions that I wrote being asked on the podcast, that's really fun. That's a really cool thing.
Mm. So if we move on a bit for your work with Comrade, how do you end up hosting The Gentleman Villain with William Regal?
Well, the adventure to get to that point was Conrad referred me to some podcasts. He goes, "Hey, you got a good voice." I'm like, "Okay, you should host a podcast." I didn't have a thought about it. Like I'd never even considered it. I said, "Okay." And then I think Terry Runnels called Conrad. This is when Conrad started getting attention. Terry Runnels said, "Can you host a podcast?" And he was too busy. So she asked me to. So I did a few episodes of that. It wasn't really for me, but I developed, I started working on my skills, did a few episodes of Medusa. And then from there, from Terry Runnels, I interviewed Robbie E. And Robbie E, for who is now Robert Stone in NXT, he called me and he's like, "I got this great idea for podcast. It's called Why It Ended. It's about wrestlers that came and went." I'm like,
Mm.
"Awesome." And what a great concept, because podcasts have to be a little different.
Yeah,
So that did well. And we interviewed Vince Russo on the show. Vince Russo liked what I did. So he asked me to host with him. And I did that for a while. And then that didn't work out. Life's too short, do things you don't totally love doing. And so I just hosted my own show for a while. That did pretty good. And I got away from wrestling entirely for a while, focus on my business, focus on my kid. And I was done. I didn't want to do any more wrestling podcasts. One day I was texting Conrad and I had no intention of getting involved in wrestling podcasts at all, producing, hosting, anything. And I knew he was going to do a show with William Regal. And I go, "Man," because Regal was on AEW. And I said, "Man, Regal is great. You're going to
mm.
have a hell of a podcast with him." And he texted me back. He's like, "You want to do it?" And I was like, "Man, I don't produce anymore. I'm not doing that anymore." He goes, "No, no, no. Do you want to host it?" And I was like, "Okay." I had no intention. I did not want to host. I did not want to produce. But dude, William Regal, like, hell yeah,
Obvious. Mm.
So I'm like, "All right, let's do it." So I worked with William Regal for, I guess 6 months or so until he went back to WWE.
Is that the reason why the podcast ended? Because he went back to WWE?
Absolutely, absolutely. That was, it wasn't said, but it just happened.
Fair,
Regal signed, the podcast stopped being made. And
fair.
it was kind of a, you know, that's just, and no one in WWE is going to get to an outside podcast outside of Bruce Pritchard.
Mm.
So it's not really surprising. I was happy for William Regal that he got to do what he wanted to do and go where he wanted to go. I wasn't particularly upset that the show ended because, Mr. Regal, he wasn't made for podcasting a lot of ways. He didn't do a lot of stuff that podcasters do. He wouldn't talk crap about people. He wouldn't respond to anything Meltzer said, like not even respond. He didn't want to hear it. And he wouldn't like guess at other people's motivations or other people's stuff. He liked talking about what he liked talking about, but it wasn't like, like the Dax show. It wasn't like Dax
Yeah.
just talks about everything. And it made me a better host. I totally understood where Mr. Regal's coming from because he doesn't want to get heat. He also doesn't want to, that's not true. It's not about heat. He just didn't want to say anything he regretted.
Yeah.
He was very careful about the way he was presented and he was perceived, and he wanted to be perceived as respectfully as he deserves to be. So he really kept it close to the vest. So, when it ended, it was fine, and I liked working with him a lot. He's great and just fascinating guy and a great human being. But when he went back to WWE, now it's a wrap.
Yeah, totally. So then, how does your current podcast, FTO Dax, come about?
Dax and I started DMing years ago, like at the Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame I went to, we met there, and
It
we
wasn't
spent.
the one where Bret Hart got where
No, it was Goldberg's Hall of Fame,
ah
and in New Orleans, 34. So we met on the bus, I think, because the way it works, it's crazy, but the way it works is you all meet in a hotel. There's a hotel waiting room where everybody's at. And then you take the bus over the venue, you wait in the backstage for another 3 hours, and then you get out there and you take a bus back. So on the bus back, we met, we talked. He knew who I was because he's a Conrad fan. Not really a Matt Koon fan, but a Conrad fan. But we've been DMing ever since. We've been talking ever since. We've been friendly. I'm a wrestling nerd. He's a wrestling historian. And, I started doing Regal. I got the bug again. And I just thought, man, Dax could have a hell of a podcast. I'm like, man, this guy, first of all, he doesn't give a crap. He says whatever he feels. He's honest, he's fearless, and he knows a lot about old wrestling. So this could be really good. It could be fun, but I also want to be successful. And
yeah.
I'm like, man, Dax could have a really good podcast. So I asked him, he was like, do you think people are going to care what I have to say? I'm like, yeah. And so, man, we planned it. We started talking about it in August, I think, and we launched in December. So it was a lot of planning, a lot of lead up, a lot of prep, and then it launched in December.
So when you talked about there Dax not really caring about I'll try to think out the phrase. Dax not really worried about what he says. Has there been anything that you're like, okay, we're going to get heat for this, but in for a penny, in for a pound?
It's interesting, right? Because what I want to do is have a successful podcast, but I don't want to screw up Dax, and I don't want to screw over anybody else either. That's the thing. Is if you notice Conrad's podcasts, or hopefully mine, we don't really like screw anybody over. We don't try to make anybody look bad, like really. But at the same time, I want a good podcast. So I don't think we've crossed that line. And there might have been once or twice. It's definitely happened with Conrad when I was producing, like, hey, maybe we should take this out. Maybe we should take that out. And I think there was one or two things in Dax thing, just little things that people would take the wrong way, or it would introduce a subject that we don't even want to freaking deal with. So just little things like that. But as far as Dax, man, he's, like the first episode of CM Punk, he talked about Brawl Out. I don't know if you remember at the time, nobody was talking about Brawl Out.
Yeah.
Nobody. And also everybody hated CM Punk then. But and I'll credit Dax with a lot of this, because of what Dax said on that podcast, it changed everything for CM Punk as far as his perception, because now you're seeing people who are saying, oh, he should come back. But that's just because CM Punk's story wasn't out there. Dax is his friend telling people who the CM Punk really was, really helped. And talking about Brawl Out in a way that didn't bury the Young Bucks, or people would expect, people who don't know think, oh, Dax hates the Young Bucks, but it's not really true. But Dax said it in a way that was like, hey, these guys need to get along. We talked about the Pinnacle on an episode recently, and that's another one that's, he's telling the truth. He thought MJF thought he was bigger than the group. He thought the group could have been better. He thought it should have been better. And because it was used for whatever reason as a vehicle for MJF with the rest of the guys as window dressing. Man,
Mm.
that's a great story. Now he works for AEW. He's gonna be back in that locker room one day, maybe. So he has to be somewhat. He can't just be like MJF's a dick. He's
Yeah.
got to. He's because you want to be professional too. It's not about being afraid. It's just about being professional sometimes.
Hmm. Have you ever had any contact with people like management in AEW that have been like, we've heard what Dax has said on a podcast, or could this please be taken out, etc.?
With Dax, um, Dax sent the copy of the CM Punk episode to AEW as a courtesy. We didn't
Yeah.
have to, but he did as a courtesy. There was a sentence because it might have been taken the wrong way by the public. They said, this sentence is kind of, if you guys want to, we're like, cool, man. We ain't trying to make no enemies. We're trying to be good to people. So that's fine. And we haven't heard anything negative from AW. I'll say, I'm sure there are wrestlers and I'm sure there's people in AW, probably WWE too, that don't like what Dax says, but it's not what Dax says. Dax doesn't say anything bad at all. What it is he talks about subjects that people don't want to talk about,
Yeah.
that you think you shouldn't talk about. So
Like
I think,
Exhibit A, for one.
right, but also, like there's nothing really there for anybody to get upset about. I think Dax is his own man, and Dax does what's best for his career, but also what's best for his soul. So he likes telling the truth. But I mean, like if Tony Khan came up to us and said, hey, do it this way or do it that way, we'd probably just stop doing the podcast, because we don't want to be beholden to somebody. But at the same time, we haven't disrespected Tony Khan at all. So I
No.
don't think they have any concern at all. Hopefully, even though we talk about a lot of things people don't want us to talk about, the way Dax does it, it usually works out.
Definitely. So you've talked about the topics that Dax has discussed and you have discussed already. What are some topics that you're like, I'd love to dig into this with Dax?
Well, one thing is, I'd love to talk about the Saudi Arabia trip where they were stuck on the plane.
Yeah, yeah.
They were on the plane. I was talking to Dax that night. I was DMing him that night. And so that's a subject that I would like to talk to him about. I'd like to talk to him about more old wrestling. Of course, we've barely touched on anything with NXT. I think we've done just 2 shows on NXT. So I'd love to get into like a Dallas takeover.
Did I see there's a revival episode coming out soon?
Yeah, yeah.
Which will be out by the time this goes out. I'll say that.
Yeah, though, we've done an episode on the beginning of the revival. We've done an episode on DIY New York, the Brooklyn takeover. But we didn't do the Toronto one, which is Toronto 3 Falls match. We haven't done American Alpha. I'd like to get more into them leaving WWE. I like to get into them getting called up to the main roster, but I'd also like to expand the show to be about more than Dax too. I would like it to be about his kind of expertise on things. Like we're having a show as we're taping on these tag team brackets, the best tag team of all time. People really responded on social media in a big way. So I think if we could do more of that, that would be great. Because Dax loves some old wrestling. Like when I was working with Regal, he was like, hey man, have you seen the Regal Zbyszko match from WCW? I'm like, why in the hell would I watch a Regal Zbyszko match? And he goes, no, it's really good. So I looked it up and I'm like, damn, like Dax knows his stuff. So, hopefully we can utilize that and not just talk about Dax's career, talk about Bret Hart too, things like that.
What about maybe put it out into the universe, some podcasts that you're like, if this wrestler wanted to do a podcast, I think that would be cool.
That's an interesting subject because there was a time I did like 4 or 5 at the same time, and it was so much work. Like I think I was doing Dutch, Mantel, Medusa, a Survivor podcast with Johnny Fairplay, and White ended with Robbie E all at the same time. It's too much, and it all suffered. So doing the Dax show correctly, doing it the best I can do it, it's like a full-time job. It's a
Mm,
lot of work. For every hour you hear, I spend about 8 hours off air.
mm.
Research, production, YouTube uploads, graphic design, social media, the whole deal. But that being said, I guess if there's a couple people, if they came to me, like if Regal came to me now, I probably would say I couldn't do it because I just couldn't, like I really want to dedicate myself to Dax. But we're talking like if Bret Hart, right?
Yeah.
I would do that probably. I'd figure it out. CM Punk,
Ooh.
um, Daniel Bryan.
Mm.
Those are the three I think. I mean, shit, Cody. Like if Cody, but I mean, Cody's in WWE, but like I like Cody a lot, personally and professionally. So I would love to do a podcast with Cody, but I think him and Conrad are going to do something 20 years from now. We'll see,
Oh, they all just sound like podcasts that I would listen to
Yeah, yeah,
as a massive wrestling nerd myself. So that makes me very happy. But as we look at wrapping this up, Matt, we're going to do a segment that I call generic questions. Those of you that have seen my interviews before
sure,
know this is where I ask my guests questions that they might get asked on social media quite regularly, such as their favorite match, favorite pay per view, favorite wrestling tag team, favorite wrestler's theme, and favorite wrestler. Basically, questions, like I say, that Matt might get asked on social media. So now he'll have a place to be like, look, I've answered this. Please go watch this. So
sure.
what's your favorite match of all time?
It changes. Um, like a favorite song.
Mm,
It can't stay your favorite song forever because by its own nature, you get tired of it because you watch it so much. I guess if I'm forced to pick, I really like Ray and Eddie from Halloween Havoc. That's a
ooh,
great match. I really like the Paul Orndorff Hulk Hogan cage match from Saturday Night's Main Event. Um, and then like in modern times, I really, really like the Orange Cassidy Pack match. The first one they had at the pay-per-view. It was the
from
first time Orange.
Revolution 20. It's either 2020 or 2019.
Yeah, it was the first time Orange Cassidy showed he could fight.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it
I know
was
what.
just this amazing piece of art. Like the AEW audience did not know what Orange Cassidy could do. They just saw him as the guy with the hands in his pockets. And Pac, he's a beast, right? He's freaking awesome.
Mm.
So he's just killing this guy. It's a piece of art that if I had to show like a non-fan wrestling and be like, here's why I'm into it, I'd probably show him Ray and Eddie or Orange Cassidy and Pac.
Mm. I should stop saying I agree because it's my guest's opinions, but I fully agree with both of those answers. What about your favorite pay per view?
Favorite pay-per-view, One Night Stand is great. The ECW One Night Stand that WWE did. Um, I really like, man, I was there, but like WrestleMania 31
Mm.
when Seth Rollins made the cash in. That was a freaking awesome show. You got like NWO and DX fighting in the middle of the ring during the Sting Hunter
Oh
match.
yeah.
You got The Rock and Ronda Rousey coming out. You got Miro and the Tank. You got Dean Ambrose and Daniel Bryan headbutting each other at the top of a ladder, and Ambrose going through the ladder. That was a great pay per view. And All In is great. It's so revolutionary. At the time. As far as the older pay per view, man, like WrestleMania 10. I
Mm.
like that one a lot.
What about your favorite wrestler's theme of all time?
Oh well, I have some experience with themes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like the first FTR theme on AW Wrestling was mine. Deanna
Mm.
Perrazzo uses my theme. Steve Macklin on Impact, future Impact World Champion, also uses a theme I did. So favorite theme of all time of you one you don't expect. I love Asuka's theme. I think when you
Ooh.
when you look at what a theme's supposed to do, right? Which is like you think about Mr. Perfect. Mr. Perfect theme added to the character, enhanced the character.
Mm.
Bum 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 bum, right? Asuka's, it's just the way her body moves as she's coming out with the mask, the whole thing. Amazing stuff. I think CFOs, who are the people that did the song, they had a few years where no one's touched them. Not
They had
Jim
some
Johnston.
bangers.
Yeah, nobody's touched them. From when you look at what they did with Finn, with Sammy, with Asuka, with Nakamura.
Keith Lee's one I'd throw in there.
What's that?
Keith Lee's one I'd throw in there.
Yeah, great stuff. Great stuff. Like CFOs, they just killed it, man. So Asuka to me, they changed the theme recently. It's terrible, And
Yeah.
Gargano's theme, man, that freaking the song with the female vocal, amazing stuff. What's something heart?
Rebel
Great.
Heart.
Rebel Heart. My God, just like every song has a different personality. Finn coming out with his hands raised in the air when it hits the high point of that song. Ain't no one did it better than CFOs. And I love Jim Johnston, but
Mm.
man, those CFOs, that NXT era, some of the best music ever made in wrestling.
Mm. I, I respect your opinion and fully agree on that one. What about your favorite tag team?
Well, I got to go with FTR, right?
Yeah, yeah.
If I take out FTR, man, I loved the Bulldogs, like because that was the first like badass tag team I ever saw. Was the Bulldogs just destroying people, destroying these enhancement talents, and then also like top rope superplexes and just the kip ups and the big flips and Dynamite, especially at the time. Dynamite was this amazing standout, so I'd say outside of FTR, the Bulldogs, British Bulldogs, man, that's my team. Like I just thought they when I was a kid, even to now, they're a revolutionary tag team, awesome team.
Mm. I've really struggled to segue these questions because I always say like I sound like I agree, and I do apologize for that.
No
But as we
worries.
wrap this up, who is your favorite wrestler of all time?
Of all time, that's tough. I haven't answered any of your questions with one answer because I
That's
suck
fine.
at that. But like as a kid, it was Paul, Mr. Wonderful Orndorff. Um, I don't know why. I can't tell you why. I just thought he was a badass. I thought he was cool. And I liked Arn Anderson a lot when I was a kid too. Um, as I got older, like my Mick Foley is a big one for me, especially in my adult years. And in my later adult years, Sami Zayn. And I was on the Sami Zayn train way before anybody else. Six,
Mm.
6 years ago, I was at a Hard Rock Cafe 5 years ago with Conrad, and I was kind of like roasting wrestling and wrestlers. Conrad's like, "All right, Koon, what wrestler do you like?" And I don't want to answer because I knew he would roast whatever I said. And Matthew speaks up. He goes, he likes Sami Zayn. Sami Zayn was in NXT at the time. And I'm like, yep, Sami Zayn's my guy. And he kind of is like, Sami Zayn? Oh my God. Right. But hey, that turned out all right. So I'm really happy for Sammy. I saw when he was in NXT, I'm like, dude, this guy could be like Daniel Bryan. Like he could be the next big deal. And sure enough, look at him now.
Yeah, 100%. But
Great.
as we wrap this up, the question I end all my interviews on is with YouTube, with podcasting, with social media in general. We're all sort of gonna live forever in some sort of very, very weird way.
Right. Right.
So, what is one piece of content you want to be remembered for, and then what is one that you're like, if people could forget about that, I would appreciate it.
That is a really good question. I'll answer the second one first. And if you have a couple more questions, I'm not super crunched for time. I don't mind answering them, but um, it, the Russo show, I did a show with Vince Russo for about 8 months called Truth with Consequences. And the idea was a non-Russo fan, me, with Russo, kind of challenging him on stuff. It just never really worked, like Vince is Vince, he's a good human being, but he's tough to work with. And I don't mean to say that, like he's not really tough to work with, but it's tough to work with somebody that people hate so much.
Yeah.
And then it's tough to work with somebody who is upset that people hate him so much over wrestling. Like it never really worked. It never really hit. So I think any of that, I would, it pretty much has. If it gets erased off the planet, I'd be really, really okay with that. I'd say like, as far as content I'm proud of, all the stuff with Dax, but particularly the second episode, which was on the dog collar match. I don't think there's been an episode of podcasting like that. Like I really, like I researched the match. I watched it like 4 times. I broke it down into like little increments of like stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and we talked about everything about that match. And I think it just showed what kind of show we were going to be. And even though, like the dog collar match, more people listen to our podcast than saw the dog collar match. Like that's not a knock
Wow,
on Ring of Honor
that's cool
because,
though.
but like Ring of Honor gets 30,000, 40,000 pay-per-view buys, right? It's not a knock on them. It's just the way the business is. So if I was smart, I probably would have picked something that more people saw. But the fact that it was so good, I'm proud of it. Like, and most people on Twitter, like listeners of ours, when you ask their favorite episode, they say the dog collar episode.
Mm. That's really cool to hear. But as we wrap this up, I am curious to know, is the dog collar episode your favorite episode, or do you have another favorite episode of the Dax
Man,
podcast?
my favorite episode is always the last one we did. Like I get so excited about every single episode. You know, when we did Punk, I was all about Punk all the way through the Pinnacle, which we just did as the show's taping. Um, and then we're doing these tag team brackets. Like the next show is always the best one. Like so. I think when I look back that dog collar one is what I'm really proud of. But I work really hard at these shows. Like I do a lot of prep and I do a lot of practice and I think about it a lot. It's not done haphazardly. So I'm proud of all of it. And every podcast that comes out, I think is the greatest one. I'm very excited. And Dax is the same way.
That's very cool to hear. So speaking of your podcast and your work, as we wrap this up, where can the good people find you and or your content?
Oh, sure. Well, FTR with Dax Harwood is available on every single podcast platform. You can go to, I'm not sure what the domain is, but it's on all your podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Music, Google Play, all that good stuff. Or you can watch on YouTube at watchdax.com. By the time you hear this, we probably would have already done our live show, hopefully made some news with it. And you can order it on Fight TV, probably. We haven't finalized that, but I think that's happening. And you can follow me on Twitter at Matt Koon Music. You can follow the show on all of its social medias, FTR with Dax on all social medias, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, some I'm probably not thinking of. But it's just really a very fun show. If you haven't heard it, it's a very different podcast. We understand there's a lot of competition for your podcasting time, your listening time. So we try to make ours unique and different and as good as it can be.
I think you guys definitely do that. And it's well worth checking out your show. I try and do the same as well. So if you guys like this video, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to Tom Talk Trash on YouTube. Follow me on Twitter at Tom Talk Trash, and I will see you in the next video. A goodbye now.